This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that General Deependra Singh has joined us once again. I requested time with the General today because he's written a wonderful new paper comparing the military abilities and capabilities between India and China. In that paper, the General goes into great detail of comparing budgets, weaponry, and also, in a sense, looks into the future of any conflict and capabilities, therefore between India and China. General, welcome.
Thank you so much, Hindol. Pleasure to be here.
I want to begin, sir, by asking you the point that you first make in the first part of your paper, which is to do with, or should I say, bang for buck. How much does India and China spend? What do they get for the amount they spend as far as military capability is concerned? And indeed, what does China really spend? There seems to be doubt about that. Could you take us through that, please?
So basically, what I've done is looked at the existing budgets of the two countries. There's a fair amount of consistency in how both countries spend as a percentage of their GDP. And as you mentioned, there is some opacity about how much China is actually spending. So I've looked at, some of the writings and, which seem to suggest that the actual expenditure is about 30% more than the official budget. Similarly, as far as India is concerned, I have also included the budgets of some of the Central Armed Police Forces, like the BSF, ITBP, Assam Rifles, because that also, these are forces, which are there in the border management. And as I said, there is a fair amount of consistency in, so China spending about 1.75% of its budget, India about 2.2%, 2.3%. And this has remained consistent. So I've also tried to sort of take it forward another 5 years and see how the gap in military spending is likely to grow. The other thing I've looked at is how do both countries spend that money? And here what we find is that while China spends approximately 40% of its budget on equipment, which is in terms of what its modernization budget is. India's budget is very heavily weighted towards personal costs, and only about 20% goes into actual modernization. So not only the total budget, I've also looked at how the budget is being spent.
The other thing that you mentioned subsequently, General, is that one big point that needs to be considered is how much of this military capability is actually indigenous. Now, this is a particularly relevant point to make because India is really pushing forth its indigenization, including in some cases even exporting armaments. But compare that with China, and China, of course, has been able to localize the production of its armaments at a much higher scale. Compare these two things and these two countries on this aspect, and give us your sort of opinion and on this.
So, Hindol, China has very, very largely, completely sort of indigenized its defense industry, and with the exception of engines, it's really not sort of dependent on imports from any other country. And here too, for its aircraft, it is developing. It's developed its own sort of engine. So largely very self-reliant. The Chinese defense industries have also grown hugely in scale and scope. India has given a massive push towards indigenization. But as the last 5 years show us that it still remains the largest defense importer in the world, accounting for almost 10% of total global imports. So while the push is there, I think it will take time. You just can't raise an indigenous defense industry, from the ground up within a few years. So I think the government's efforts are praiseworthy. I think the push that has been given, I don't see at all it sort of turning back. But I think over the next decade or so, you will really see the transformation of the Indian defense industry on the ground. Until then, we will be, at least for large platforms, reliant on foreign manufacturers. So we're seeing that in the case of aircraft, although the LCA is coming in. But India still wants to import some aircraft. The aircraft for our aircraft carriers, Rafales, we are getting. For submarines, we are looking at foreign manufacturers. So where large defense equipment is concerned, I think for the next decade or so, we will still be reliant on foreign manufacturers.
In such a scenario, which you just painted out, what impact in real terms does it have on the sort of war capabilities of these two countries?
So, as I said, as far as China is concerned, its indigenous defense industry has really geared up. So, we are seeing the pace at which they're building, for example, ships.
Yes.
Naval ships. Today, they are the largest navy in terms of numbers in the world, the largest coast guard, commercial shipping. They've captured almost 50% of the global market. So, aircraft, tanks, everything is something that they are able to produce indigenously and develop it in the way that they want. As far as India is concerned, look, foreign equipment comes at a huge cost. We're seeing billions of dollars being spent on aircraft, on things like the Predator drones, on the S-400. So one is the cost, and the second, of course, is the dependency that you get on foreign equipment, and in some cases it can be troublesome, as we are seeing in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war. Our heavy dependence on Russian equipment, we are having difficulties in procuring spares. I think the air chief did mention that. The S-400, for example, delivery got delayed because of the war. So foreign dependency does have its own disadvantages. And the last point is, nobody is going to part with its crown jewels. So the really cutting edge technology is not something that you're likely to get from foreign manufacturers, something that I think we'll have to develop ourselves.
A lot of people don't understand this. A lot of the sort of diplomatic, to and fro that's happening at the moment, even between India and the United States, some of that goes back into history to India's reliance on Russian weaponry, as you just mentioned. One of the reasons that, as the Prime Minister said, Russia is an quote unquote all weather friend. Interesting phraseology. It's a phraseology that Pakistan uses for China. Yeah. But Russia is our all weather friend because, of course, we've had this dependence and we continue in many ways to have this dependence. And that, of course, has many manifestations. Talk to us a little bit about this reliability question, General. This has a history, of course. Talk us through, what kind of concerns we might still have on reliability. We are one of the biggest weapon purchasers in the world, but reliability, becomes a bit of a question as far as geopolitics is concerned sometimes.
It does, because we are already seeing that. When we procured the S-400, the US was saying that, CAATSA could be sort of imposed. If there are sort of financial sanctions on different countries, for example, on Russia, then sometimes the issue of, transaction, how we pay for these things, sometimes the Indian firms feel that they could also be caught up in the sanctions in dealing with Russia. So there is this whole geopolitical mix, which you cannot divorce from when you're looking at weapon imports.
I want to touch upon something else you said, General, before I move on. You mentioned the pace at which China is building ships. Now, by some estimates, it is adding the size of the Indian Navy every few years into its naval forces. What are that seems very intimidating, but there are chinks in that armor, isn't it? What are the chinks in that armor? Even though China is building at this pace, there are still some lacunae and loopholes which makes them vulnerable. What, according to you, are these?
So I think, see, the equipment that they are introducing now, the newer class of ships and destroyers, even the newer aircraft carriers, I think in some ways are almost on par with world-class standards. So the issue I would say is in their ability to operate at long distances. They haven't had the training or the experience, for example, that the US has in operating aircraft carriers. So that I think is something that they will take time, to really build an expeditionary force like what the US has. And the second thing which I have mentioned, I think as far as maritime space is concerned, is that they're fairly constricted geographically. And I make that mention because
Yes.
uh, while sort of looking towards the Pacific, you have the first island chain where America has a large number of bases. For them to operate in the Indian Ocean, where 80% of their energy trade flows, they have to enter the Indian Ocean through these very narrow maritime straits of Malacca, Sunda, Lombok, and then operating at such long distances, from their own bases, poses a challenge to them. So while they are a growing sort of maritime power, their ability to really operate very far from their home bases currently is still limited.
Other point that you make in your paper, General, is about modernization and reform within the armed forces, and you compare the reform maneuvers that the Indian military system and the Chinese military are making, and how effective these are. Talk us through. You talk about theater commands, you talk about unit size, and a whole bunch of other things. Talk us through some of the most important points in your opinion, where these two armies are in a sense reforming, and what impact those reforms are having on the ground.
Frankly, the reform process that has been undertaken by the PLA is fairly impressive. So starting in 2015, they have these theater commands that were put in place, which were tri-service sort of integrated commands. They reduced their manpower very, very significantly and substantially. At that time, they had created the rocket force as a separate service, equivalent to Army, Navy, Air Force. So the emphasis that they were giving to both conventional and then nuclear missile capability. They had an SFF strategic force which they created, which combined electronic warfare, space, cyber under one organization. Basically, and a lot of joint operations command centers were put in place. So the idea was that they were moving from what was once an army-dominated force to a more joint, structure. And I think they have achieved it. Recently, this year only, they have now, created three separate forces: aerospace force, cyberspace force, and information support force, which is the attention and importance that they're giving to these areas, which we call new dimensions of warfare, space and cyber, and information. So I think in that sense, it's fairly impressive the manner in which they've gone about carrying out military reforms with the aim of enhancing their sort of joint operational capability. Now, how they've gone, there are still some questions being raised on, their training standards, how realistic the training is. But I think the structures are all in place. I have also stated in my paper that we are almost 10 years behind the PLA. So while we have been talking about integrated theater commands after the CDS was formed, the Chief of Defense Staff, and we had been hearing for many years about integrated theater commands will come up. Unfortunately, I mean, it still hasn't come in place. So we are hearing that there could be 3 integrated theater commands: the Northern, Western, and the Maritime Theater Command. And some of the planning for that seems to have been done, but as of now, there is no sort of concrete approval that has been given by the government. And even if we assume that it happens, say, today, it'll still take, I've said, another year for these formations and these organizations to come up on the ground, which is 2025, which is why I'm saying we are about 10 years, behind the PLA's reform process. So I just hope this comes up in a hurry, because once these are in place, there is also a need for joint command and control, joint operational planning, joint logistics, and all this actually will take shape once the integrated theater commands come up.
Because true, what are you mentioned theater commands, what are the other major reforms the Indian military forces are trying to make? And if we are nearly a decade, like you say, behind China, and we are facing some of our deepest threats from China, how vulnerable does that make us, General?
No, so, I wouldn't say it makes you very vulnerable, because you have 3 forces in place already. So anything that happens on the borders or at the sea, we are still sort of fairly comfortable as far as that is concerned. I think where we are lacking is, in case of a large scale conventional war, how will the 3 services sort of come together and fight in an integrated fashion? That is something that we still don't have. We don't have a joint sort of war fighting doctrine. We don't have a joint operational doctrine, and we don't have the structures in place. So that is something, I think, when we look at future war, we need an integrated, war fighting machinery, which unfortunately is not there today. Yes, there is cooperation and coordination between the 3 services. I'm not saying, the Air Force and the Army will completely fight separate battles. That's not the case. But real integration will come when you have a single theater commander, controlling the resources and then seeing how best they can be employed. In other areas, yes, we have done some reorganizations. A cyber agency has come up, a space agency has come up. We had wanted in the military that these should come up as commands, larger structure. But the government sanctioned these as agencies, which are smaller organizational structures. But at least we have these now in place. I mean, we were one military that for a long time didn't have a dedicated cyber organization. So at least that is in place. And recently, I think we've also released a cyber doctrine. So that's a good step.
Glad you mentioned cyber warfare, because that brings me to the next part of my question that I wanted to ask you. In many of these critical technologies, as they are sometimes called these days, in AI, in robotics, in quantum computing, and things like that, China seems to be really outpacing most of the world. In fact, some would say in some cases, even the United States. How vulnerable are we there, General? Because, we don't seem to have the ability. We also have good technology, but we don't seem to quite be keeping pace at all.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, China really has become world leader in some of these technologies, particularly quantum. Cyber, they are considered like the number 2 power in the world, just behind the United States. What is the vulnerability? I think there is vulnerability in the Indian system, and the main vulnerability, Noel, is that we are still in a lot of our critical infrastructure dependent on foreign hardware and software. So your communication networks, for example, BSNL, which is our largest communication network provider, has, by some estimates, 50% Chinese equipment. Our power system, our sort of power companies had a lot of Chinese equipment. I think that makes us vulnerable. until we can be completely dependent on our own indigenous equipment and software, we will remain vulnerable to cyber attacks. And some of that we've already seen, the Bombay power outage, uh, we know now was certainly caused by some cyber attack. So these are the sort of vulnerabilities that we have today, which we need to, and some of us have been saying that unless you're able to completely indigenize at least our critical infrastructure, we will face threats and challenges.
This brings me to the last point that I wanted to ask you, General. India always seems to be on this issue that we are discussing, be divided into two camps, as it were. There is a bring in more foreign investment camp, which sort of says, well, perhaps we go too far. There was a press note which said which blocked investment from certain areas of the world. That caused concern. Many Chinese telecom companies have been questioned and their activities in India, what kind of technology they're deploying, what kind of data is being gathered, and so on and so forth. But this camp says, no, actually, we are too protective. This is protectionism. We need Chinese money. We need greater investments. Bring that in. The other people say that, look, I mean, we need to be far more careful. The world is moving towards that. Look at the Huawei case. Actually, many people, even in the West, began by saying, no, let's give them a chance. But actually, now most countries are very cognizant that this is a threat. Where do you stand in that debate, sir? And what are we doing? What should we be doing which we are not doing enough?
So, I completely stand with the camp that says that at least in our critical infrastructure, we should only bring in sort of trusted equipment. And it's not something that only India is saying. I mean, as you mentioned, Huawei. So the US has banned Huawei systems, not permitting them to now participate in 5G, 6G, etc. China has also, to a very large extent, banned things like Microsoft products, Windows, Apple for official work. So it isn't as if we are, India's, the only country that is looking at that seriously. As I mentioned, we had not paid enough attention to this in our critical areas. There was, I think, one media report which I read that all naval establishment, the security cameras were all Chinese. Now, so
That's
I think,
astounding. That is
yeah,
truly astounding.
yeah. So I think that those are areas that, and we know that this hardware can be manipulated. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt. There is a Chinese law which says that all private companies will assist in Chinese intelligence efforts. I mean, it's no secret. So I'm not saying we should do a complete sort of blanket ban on anything, but at least areas where security is important, areas where our critical infrastructure is involved. Those are areas where we certainly need to see who the suppliers are.
Generally, as you're saying this, I'm reminded of the fact that, in fact, ironically enough, one of the most used platforms for the exchange of emails within government in India is Gmail. And I think people have pointed this out repeatedly that this may not be the best idea, but somehow we haven't been able to fix this kind of glaring gaps. Why are we not able to fix them, General?
I don't know. I think we haven't sort of given enough incentive to our own sort of, indigenous products. So let me give you my own sort of personal example. Is when I was in Northern Command, so we had decided that, look, we need to get away from Windows. And I know you say it's American, but I mean, Americans snoop as much as anybody else does.
Of course.
And that we should have our own indigenous product, which was developed by us, which is called BOSS, Bharat Operating System. And we did deploy it for a couple of years. Yes, there were teething problems, initial issues. But I think, faced a lot of sort of pushback saying, why are you getting away from, what is a user-friendly product? And my argument always was, look, user-friendliness is really not an answer for where security is concerned. But later I'm told, the whole process got rolled back, and we are back to the Windows operating system. So sometimes I think enough incentive is not being given to the indigenous products. Is still fairly heavily reliant on foreign companies.
Fascinating and a fantastic anecdote, General. Many more people should hear about this anecdote. Let me ask you the last question then. One of the reasons is, of course, incentive, as you pointed out, sir. Is the other reason a basic lack of, even within our sort of systems, a lack of understanding of mission criticality as far as security is concerned? Are we lax generally as a people? Are we lax about security?
Yeah, we are. No, I have no doubt about this. And not only among people, I think even among some of our leadership, there is a lack of understanding of how critical these areas are today, particularly when we're looking at cyber threats or threats in the information space, for example. So these are things we need to critically sort of look at what our dependencies are, what are the challenges. Uh, I think after Snowden revelations, and you could see the scope of surveillance being carried out by countries,
Right.
and of course America, and we know that almost all the American technology companies were involved in this surveillance network. We also know that China has one of the largest mass surveillance, platforms and systems in the world. So, after knowing all this, still to just sort of close our eyes and say, "Oh, in our critical spaces, it doesn't matter, which company has and whether it's foreign or not." Uh, I know recently, I think people, I think it was the Ola chairman who talked about all our data, going abroad.
Yes.
And from there, it is, utilized, tools are developed using our data, and it comes back to India and is sold to us at, enormous cost. So these are some issues I think. I'm not saying there's a clear-cut answer to all of these, but I think it should occupy a lot of our attention, and I think there should be more informed debate around these areas.
General Hooda, as always, wonderful talking to you. We'll leave it at that for now, but very insightful comments and incisive things for us to think about. Thanks very much, General, for your time.
Thank you very much. As always, a pleasure to be here.